All right. Well, it is good to see you all. I'd ask how the kids are doing, but the real question at this point is, how are the parents doing? Because you all know the best is yet to come, because every kid's love language is a 35-minute monologue from a middle-aged pastor, right? Now, if it would help, I would tell you kids love me. It would be patently untrue, but if it helps to think that, go for it. Listen, if you are a parent in the room, and again, your kids are restless, I understand that. Let them move about. It is fine today. We are all in the boat together, and it's not going to bother me, and if it does bother me, I'm not going to tell you it bothers me, so that way you live guilt-free, and we do what we do. We're in this, and I'm glad you're here, because I really do think God has something important to say today, and we're going to put that out there and see what he wants to say to all of us, because we're jumping back into this series called Asking for a Friend. Each week, what we're doing is just taking one subject. We're diving into a different faith-related topic based on questions you and quite possibly your friends are asking. Now, today's big topic is around this idea of beliefs, and I'm going to tell you right up front, I'm not working off of one specific question that was asked today. What happened is we received a number of different questions about beliefs, and it may not surprise you to hear that there are many people that actually have many different beliefs. A lot of different ideas came in across the web, and not only do hold people different beliefs, but they feel very strongly and very passionately about some of the things that they do believe. And I don't think that's at all unique to the church. In fact, I think that's an everybody thing. That's an everybody thing, because everybody actually has a belief system, whether you know that or not. It doesn't matter if you're young or old. It's not even a religious or a non-religious thing. Everybody has a belief system. Everybody has a set of beliefs that add up to kind of a way in which they see and interact with the world. And so it's no surprise we live in a world where ideas collide all the time. And some of you know this to be true. No kidding. Like even in your own house, you may say, I don't even have agreement in my own house, under my own roof when it comes to belief systems. We run into different people with different ideas and different practices all around us. And here's the challenge. When our beliefs collide with somebody else's beliefs, there's a chance that it creates tension. It can create tension. Disagreements cause tension in relationships. It can be friendships. It can be marriages, it could be parents to their kids, it could be somebody at work. Those tensions fall into your neighborhood. Tensions exist because naturally we may see things differently and do things in different ways. Now, some of the debates that we have are kind of lighthearted and fun. Some of you are sports fans and you don't mind spending endless hours talking about who's better, LeBron or Jordan, right? I know, see right there, I started it up again. Nicholas or Woods, like, are you Red Sox, Yankees? Like, you go on and on and on, and it gets very spirited and very passionate, but the truth is, it's hardly life-altering, right? But then there are other subjects that quickly you jump into, and you realize they're less lighthearted, much more substantial. You start talking about politics. Right? Last couple years, let's talk about health care, right? What should we believe and do with health care? What about social issues? What about gun control? What about abortion legislation? How about immigration? How about the economy? Right? Jump into those subjects, and what happens? You see blood pressure rise. Yours and other people's, right? Because there's this challenge in front of us. Why? Competing ideas, competing beliefs, when they collide together, it feels like it's a direct and personal challenge. And when someone challenges us, there's a sense that we want to be defensive. We have to oppose the beliefs that sit in front of us because they create some kind of threat. And we want to protect our turf, we want to defend our turf, and pretty soon what started as a conversation actually becomes a competition, and I need to prove that I'm right and that you're wrong, because our ideas need to carry the day. And if we're not careful, we get into these habits of needing and wanting to defend everything we believe, everything we do, because if we don't fight for what we believe, we feel like we're just conceding. And we never want to give a concession for fear that just maybe the other side, whatever that other side is to us, might win. And so there's a collision of belief and practice, but it escalates into disagreements, and disagreements, again, when handled poorly, quickly turns into division. And that division creates a fracturing of relationships. And so sadly, this feels very familiar, doesn't it? It's sort of a commentary on this adversarial culture that we're living in. But I think the real sad thing is that this same feeling, this same idea, these same practices can creep into the church. And they do creep into the church because there are differences in what we believe. There are differences in what we practice when it comes to faith. And ultimately, differences when it comes to faith definitely leads to tension. And tension can affect relationships, ultimately creating a very unwanted and painful division among individuals and even broad bodies of believers. And so that's why today we're talking about this right here. We're talking about beliefs. But what we're not doing today is I'm not going to stand up here and tell you what it is we believe. No, I'm asking a more provocative question, which is this. How should we think about the things that we think about? Not what do we think, how? How should we think about the things we think about? In other words, how should we actually approach issues of beliefs? And how should we approach the things that we practice? Because I believe we need to carefully consider why we believe what we believe and how we exercise the things that we do. And so as we jump in to try to answer this question, here's the big idea right up front. I'm going to start by this understanding that not all beliefs are created equal. Not all beliefs are created equal. In other words, not everything we believe, even in the church, not everything we believe or do in the church carries the same amount of weight. And not everything we believe and do has the same measure of significance. For some of you, this may be sort of a brand new concept today. Maybe if you're newer to your faith, for many of you, this just serves as a reminder that when it comes to the truth that we find in the pages of the Bible, God himself actually points out a differentiation between levels of belief. When it comes to the things that we believe and practice in Christianity, there are things that are essential and there are things that are non-essential. God actually differentiates for us things that are essential and things that are non-essential. The faith is made up of essential things. Christianity has essential things, essential beliefs and practices. I'm going to call those the DNA of the Christian faith. The DNA. In other words, DNA contains genetic instruction that builds life forms. If you don't have a DNA, you don't have a life form. Or if somehow your DNA gets damaged or it goes missing, then mutations occur and then it fails to be what it was designed to be. And in order to build true Christian faith, to have the core of the gospel intact, you've got to have some essential foundational DNA elements. Those are the essential things. The things that God makes most clear, and in many ways, the things that God deems to be most important. And I'm going to say it in a strong way. The essentials of faith, those are the things that we're willing to die for. Quite literally, people have died for. They are the things that we suffer ridicule for. They are the things that you will be persecuted for. They may be some things over time that you would actually break fellowship over. And I don't mean in a harsh way or a divisive way. I simply mean they're not things that you can agree to disagree on, even in the church. There have to be some things we stand distinct from. And so if you disagree with the gospel, it means that the gospel, the core of Christianity, is no longer intact. There are essential things. Now, here's an example of that. New Testament church in Galatia. New Testament church in Galatia, the Apostle Paul, one of the most prolific writers of the New Testament, writes to the church in Galatia because he has to not only address, but actually vehemently defend an essential truth that had gotten off track. And here's what Paul writes. Paul says, hey, when Peter came to Antioch, Peter is the disciple you're thinking of, one of the 12. Peter came to Antioch, and Paul says, I opposed him to his face. Two followers of Jesus, two people close to the process, about to kind of duel it out. Why? Because Paul said, listen, I saw that there was something happening. There's a they who were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel. Something happening not in line with the truth of the gospel. Here's what was happening in that first century. The church was being formed. And as that church is being formed, there was the merging of two people groups. You had the Jews and you had the Gentiles. Now, the Jewish people, many of you may know, the Jewish people are people steeped in tradition, steeped in rules, steeped in laws. They had all kinds of laws about what they could eat and dietary rules and Sabbath rules and big things about circumcision, all these things that they had detailed out. And for the Jewish culture, many of them believed that their salvation rested on their ability to keep the law and adhere to the Torah. But then you have that group converging with this Gentile group. The Gentile group are like, hey, we're kind of non-religious types. We're just joining the party. Jesus, we heard he died, he buried, was raised, and resurrected, and by grace I can be saved. And so you've got Jews and Gentiles, excuse me, coming together in this moment. And here's this they. You've got a group of Jewish people, even followers of Jesus, still believing that they should force the Gentiles to take on some of their practices, including circumcision, in order to be saved. They wanted to add to the core of the gospel through their works. And that's when Paul said, I'm going to oppose you to your face. That is not in line with the truth of the gospel. Paul sets things straight. And he goes on and he tells us this critical truth. He said, a person is not justified by the works of the law. He makes it crystal clear. But faith in Jesus Christ. He said, we have put our faith in Christ Jesus that we may be justified by faith in Christ, not by works of the law. Why? Because by works of the law, no one will be justified. He says the same thing, says it about 3 times. Why? Because an example of an essential belief. To believe otherwise would be to literally mutate the DNA of the core gospel message. There are some of those beliefs and some practices in Christianity that in the Scripture are essential. Salvation by grace alone, through faith alone, in Jesus alone, that's one of them. And Paul makes it clear. There's others. I mean, we could lock down a list. There's certain things about the nature of who God is that are absolutely essential. The nature of who Jesus are that's very essential. The fact that there was an actual bodily resurrection of Jesus. The fact that the Bible is the inspired Word of God, and the list goes on. Paul rightly identifies and he defends these essential beliefs. But with that being said, keep in mind, not everything is an essential belief. We also have non-essential beliefs. Non-essential beliefs and practices. Non-essential. Not essential, but also, you need to know this, doesn't mean non-important. Non-essential doesn't mean not important. In fact, many of the non-essential beliefs and practices that we find in Scripture are actually very important. They're good, they're right, they're God-honoring. And there may be a lot of good reason why we believe on something, why we would do something. There's purpose behind it. It simply doesn't rise to the level of that core DNA. It's more about individual decision. It's more about personal conviction. It doesn't demand uniformity for everyone, including us in the room. And it's not something we're going to die for. Non-essentials are not something we die for. It's not something we break fellowship for. And even at times when it's very difficult to do so, we actually could look at each other and agree to disagree around some of these non-essential things. And just as Paul offered up an example of what it looks like to address an essential, he also addresses a non-essential to the church in Rome. As Paul is working with the church in Rome, this is what he says to those folks. He said, I want you to accept the one whose faith is weak without quarreling over what he calls disputable matters. Paul makes a reference to disputable matters. That's a great way to think of non-essential things. Disputable means it's not core. It is not something that God has made clear in his word. Maybe another way to think of that is to think of it like this. It's not something that God condones, but it's also not something that God condemns. It's not something you have to do for your faith, but it's not something that you have to abstain from in your faith. I think that makes sense. And in this instance, the specific disputable matter that he's talking about is the eating of food, in particular, a certain type of meat. He says there's a person's faith that allows them to eat anything, including meat, but then there is another whose faith is weak and they eat only vegetables. Quick bit of context there. In that Roman culture where they were living, there was paganism, there was idol worship that was practiced. And during certain pagan rituals, they would actually use meat as a form of sacrifice to that idol. And so following the pagan rituals, though, you have this meat. And the meat, instead of just getting thrown out, might be given to shop owners or sold back in the main marketplace. And so what would happen inevitably is that some of the meat that at one point had been sacrificed to an idol was sold for social functions, including gatherings in the church, in the temple. And so you've got church groups, for lack of a better term, sitting down with a piece of meat in the middle of the table that at one point had been sacrificed to an idol. And you've got part of the people in the room who are saying, I'll eat that. That looks good. Put it on the grill. It's just meat. I mean, it's just meat. It's not infused with anything. It's just meat. Why would we not eat it? But you've got other good-hearted believers who are saying, wait a minute. It doesn't feel right to me that this meat that at one point was sacrificed to an idol sitting in front of me, that I would want to be a part of that. Or maybe they themselves at one point had participated in pagan rituals and were a part of it and thought, this for my conscience draws me back to something that I thought was inappropriate now. And as I'm following Jesus, I need to push away from that and stand distant from it. And so the real question at hand was this. Can a follower of Jesus eat the meat? Yes, he can. She can. Do they have to eat the meat? No. Who's right? No one, right? It's a non-essential, disputable matter. It wasn't commanded. It wasn't condemned. And Paul even says, look what Paul says. He says, the one who eats everything, that's the person that's eating meat, should what? Convince everybody else around them to eat meat? Nope. Must not treat with contempt the one who's not going to eat it. And the one who's not going to eat it should what? Tell everybody else they can't eat it? Nope. Don't judge the one who does, because God has accepted them. Listen, non-essential beliefs and practices, here's the key. They're very, very important, but they need not be divisive. They're not core to the nature of the gospel. Paul later, even in that very text, goes on to say that everybody should be convinced in their own mind when it comes to these types of things. And so in the church, that's you, that's me. We need to be convinced of certain things, be thoughtful about non-essential beliefs. It might be things like the timing and the nature of God's creative work. Is it 6 days of literal creation or not? What about the end times? What about tribulation and rapture and all these other things, right? What about the nature and practice of communion and all this kind of stuff? Like, some of those are non-essential beliefs. Important, yes. Core to the gospel, no. Some of the bigger issues today are actually not just non-essential beliefs, it's non-essential practices. They talk about meat here. We talk about things like alcohol today. Is it appropriate and is it right for a follower of Jesus to drink alcohol? Short of drunkenness, is it okay to drink socially? Some of you would say, of course it is. It's just a drink. Others of you say no, and you have very good reason why that may not be the case. Some of you have different ideas about what we can watch and what we should pay attention to with different types of movies and things. Some of you are like, hey, we can't watch Stranger Things. Some of you are like, I love Stranger Things, and I love it now because it's getting stranger in season 4, right? Not going to wreck any, no spoilers, right? Non-essential doesn't mean non-important. It just means you have to have important discussions around it. And at the end of the day, there's freedom. God is not saying you can, He's not saying you can't. We don't need to get spun up and divided about all of that stuff. So big picture, how do we think about the things we think about? Where do we even start thinking about the things we think about? We start here. We approach issues of faith and practice through this lens of what is essential and what is non-essential. Not everything is the same weight. Not everything is the same significance. So herein lies the challenge. Herein lies the challenge, the practical challenge. While this makes sense, feels like a fairly simple answer, there isn't necessarily one master list that clearly identifies what is essential and what is non-essential. Because believe it or not, and I know this will shock you, there's actually disagreement over these things. And so here's the challenge. Everybody, as an individual, everybody as a family needs to do the work over time of thinking through what they think about. You need to think through and assess what it is you believe and what it is you do. You need to determine what you consider to be essential. What is God saying to you about what is essential? What is it that is non-essential? You need to read. You may need to do some study. You need to ask questions. You may need to take time of introspection. You may need to examine your conscience. All of those things to rightly determine where they fit for you. And I want to help you do that. I want to at least help you take a step in that direction. So with that as a starting point, here's what we're going to do for our last 15 minutes today. So kids, hang with us. 15 minutes, I'm going to offer you a helpful, hopeful, memorable framework that's going to do one thing. It's just going to help you personally process or evaluate and help to sort out some of your beliefs and practices. Help you to put into practice this idea of how do I think about the things I think about. And here's what I'm going to call it. I'm going to call it the 3 buckets of belief. The 3 buckets of belief. Now, as I start this, I will tell you, don't look for it in the Bible. It's not there. I just made it up. Sort of. Someone told me this years ago, and I still remember it today. That's how memorable it is. And I think this word picture will help you process better how it is we sort out beliefs. So we have a bucket, and I'm going to call it the convictions bucket. We have convictions. Think of those convictions as the absolute essentials. Those are the things, when you think conviction, think convinced. You are fully convinced, and no one is going to persuade you otherwise. Those are the things you need to be willing to protect. Those are the hills you're going to die on in relation to the gospel. And here's the truth. Those are the things you should be most committed to and probably most studied up on, because you need to know the most about them so that you can stand firmly. Now, the truth is, it's not a very big bucket, actually. There's only a few of those. There are only a few convictions. But because there are a few, you hold them very, very tightly. But there's another bucket, and I'm going to call that the bucket of persuasions. Persuasions. Think of the word persuaded. Now, this goes into that non-essential category, persuaded. And what that means is you have been persuaded about something. In your heart, in your mind, there is very good reason why you believe what you believe and why you do what you do. You've done a lot of work to figure it out. You've got a strong leaning one way or another. The other thing you need to recognize, though, Other people may have a very strong leaning one way or another as well in the same category, and it's okay because it's non-essential. So you have more of these than you do convictions. You have a few convictions, but you will have some persuasions. Some things you're very persuaded about, and you hold them not tightly, but definitely hold them thoughtfully. Meaning you have a pretty good grasp on why it is you feel as strongly as you do about those persuasions. All right? Then there's another bucket. Love this bucket. That's the bucket of opinions. Didn't know you had an opinion bucket, did you? Opinion, certainly non-essential. Now, when you think opinions, literally we're now at this point just talking preferences. There may be some scriptural evidence around some things. God may speak to it and poke at it, but the truth is, really, we're not talking about right or wrong things here. We're talking about something that's probably formed more from personality, from kind of who you are, your type, how God has wired you, how God has made you. Some of it's related to your style of learning, maybe the experience you've had, could be the family you brought up in, it's the history you know. And so for whatever reason, you just have certain preferences, ways of seeing and doing things. And that's this opinion bucket right here. And I'll tell you what, you've got lots of them. So do I. Many. But because there's not necessarily a strong right or wrong basis, God has not given us that, we hold them fairly loosely. So you get the framework, right? Convictions, persuasions, opinions. It's a way of processing. It's a way of understanding our faith. Now, I'll tell you this, though, just a cheat. You could actually use this for a lot of things in your life. Like, you can use this little arrangement to think through a lot of things. How you parent. You can think about that as a parent. I've had to do this. My kids, from young, now they get older and this and that. I have to ask myself all the time, when I think about parenting, what for me is an absolute core conviction? Meaning, what is a hill to die on in my house with my son or daughter or whoever it is, right? Like, what is a non-negotiable? But then one of those things where I, as a parent, am very convinced, and I need to kind of figure out how I'm going to manage that. And then there's some where I just need to be honest and say, you know what, I'm a dad, and I've just got some opinions, and there's not a right or wrong. I'm just telling you it's my preference, right? Sometimes it's really helpful to know the difference when you're parenting. Sometimes it's really helpful to know the difference in a relationship, in a friendship. Like, what for you is a core conviction of marriage? Maybe you're not married yet, and you're looking at it, and you're thinking, man, let's talk about that. What is a core conviction? What are our persuasions? And quite frankly, what are just preferences? What about money? You could ask that with money. What's the conviction when it comes to my money? Persuasion, right? You get the idea. But it applies to our faith. It applies to faith. Because if we don't regularly evaluate and process our faith, what we believe and what we do, we can start to think that some things are more important than they are, and we can forget that some things are actually less important than they are. And we can harm relationships because of those kinds of disagreements. And so this framework right here, I want you to use it just to ask one question. One question. Have I put everything in the correct bucket? That's the assessment question. When it comes to these areas of my life, have I put everything in the correct bucket? And I'll be honest, if you look hard enough, you probably all have something or some things that maybe we've put in the wrong bucket. I know I have in the past, and even probably today, still hold some things in the wrong buckets. And so there's challenges and pitfalls to all of these. We look at this right here, our convictions bucket. It's supposed to be few of them. Here's the biggest challenge with our conviction bucket. We tend to want to put too many things in it. We tend to want to put too many things in it. The extreme version is the person who says, oh, convictions, absolutely. Right? And they take everything in every other bucket, and they believe everything is a core conviction. You ever met somebody like that? Everything is life or death. Everything is right or wrong. Everything is black or white. And they believe God has somehow built for us this system where everything falls in place. And if that's you, I'm going to be honest, boy, you've got a lot of work to figure out every last piece of understanding from a theological perspective. And you better fine-tune every last detail of how you act and respond in every situation. Because everything is a battle. Everything is a hill to die on if everything is a conviction. And some of you have run into some people like that. And the problem is they spend a lot of time having to defend themselves. They defend their ideas, and ultimately they defend God. But in the process of defending themselves and their ideas in God, what they're doing is actually offending everybody else. Because no one can live up to the full weight of all of their convictions. And so people tend to just push away from them and stop arguing. And I'm not saying don't stand up for what you believe. Don't be here to say that. I'm not saying there aren't core convictions that you stand on. I'm just saying the biggest challenge sometimes is that we try to put way too many things. We try to overfill this conviction bucket. And the challenge is really looking with introspection and saying, is that actually core to the gospel? So there's a caution there. So now persuasions. Let's talk about the persuasion bucket. Persuasion bucket. Remember, if it's a persuasion for you, it means you have good reason. There may be good scholarship. You may have an important matter of conscience for a reason why you believe what you believe that's in this bucket. Here's what you have to remember. There is somebody else who disagrees with you. And that person that disagrees with you, they themselves may have very good reason, very good scholarship, and a very good matter of conscience that stands opposed. And so I'll say it this way. Even though it is a persuasion for you and you're strongly persuaded, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're right. Just because we're persuaded doesn't mean we're right. I remember walking into seminary years ago, a couple decades ago, and I walked into seminary somehow thinking that I had a lot of things figured out. I'd read a lot, I had heard speakers, I had been like many of you, you read books, you get a lot of stuff in your head. And I was excited to go to seminary because I actually thought what was going to happen is they were going to simply cement down everything I knew to be true. And I remember sitting there in shock and awe in the very first semester when these professors, who were quite frankly much older than me, much smarter than me, much more mature than me, much more accomplished than me, offered viewpoint after viewpoint that were different than what I had known and different than what I had heard around these persuasion issues. And I quickly became very aware of one thing, that there are a lot of theological persuasions that can be strongly argued one way or another. And some of those debates have been going on since the beginning of time, and those same debates will go on until the end of time. And what I found very quickly in seminary, it wasn't how much I was going to learn. Seminary taught me one thing. It taught me how much I don't know. That's what I learned. I learned how much I don't know and how much good information is out there. It was a form of forced humility, is really what it was. But it was a good humility, and it's a good humility we all need, because when we address people in this persuasion bucket, we need just enough humility to help us hold loosely enough to see the other side of an argument. We need just enough humility to see other people who have different persuasions in belief and practice and interact with them with respect and honor, even in areas where we differ. That's where humility comes in. And we may be strongly persuaded, and that doesn't mean you need to change. It just doesn't mean you're always right. There's always more room for growth, always more room for understanding. So there's challenges with convictions, there's challenges with persuasions, and then there are certainly some challenges when it comes to our opinions. Here's the challenge with the opinion bucket or the preference bucket, is that over time, I think we're all prone to this. I think we all want to feel just a little bit stronger about the things we think and do than we should. And so what happens with our opinions, we think, yeah, it's just an opinion, it's just a preference. But over time, there's drift, and we kind of start to pour off some of those, and we somehow convince ourselves that some of the things that were opinions are actually more merited than we think they are. We have a tendency sometimes to spend time with people around us that think the same way we think and act the same way we think. So what happens? You may have a certain opinion, and guess what? It gets reinforced as correct. Well, everybody around me thinks it's right, even though it's just a preference, but everybody I know does it, right? Maybe you read certain things, and what it does is it reinforces your opinions and your preferences, and maybe you watch a certain news station, right? And maybe that reinforces something. Maybe there's actually an algorithm on social media that feeds you certain things, and you're not aware of it, right? All these things are happening, and so what happens over time is your opinions all of a sudden drift, and you think that they're persuasions, and when that happens, we are prone to want to convince everybody else that our opinion and our persuasions are correct, and that leads to problems. Funny example, there are some of you in the room right now who think that folding towels, there is a right and wrong way to fold towels. You know that's true. There are some of you in the room that married someone, and when you got married, you didn't know that there was a right or a wrong way to fold a towel. And there's not a right or wrong way to fold a towel or a t-shirt, right? But the truth is, right, see, you believe it's a persuasion, I know that, and here's why. Because if I ask you how you fold the towel, some people are like, well, it's the size of the towel. You have to understand the bifold versus the trifold. And the shelf you put it on, if he knew better, I mean, you understand it fits better, right? And you start to add all these things up, and it's funny and it's goofy, but you realize what at one point was just a preference, you've got some logic behind it now. But here's the thing, and don't miss this. Here's the thing. When something is an opinion and we turn it into a persuasion, before long, we hold it as an expectation for everybody else. That's what happens. And we do it in our relationships, we do it in our marriages, we do it in our friendships, things that we care about from a preferential side. We start to think and expect and want everyone to act in line. And that's where relationships get strained over things that are truly non-essential. Important, but not essential. Listen, it happens all around us. It happens in the church. That actually happens in the church. Some of you maybe know that. Simple truth is that in the church there are sometimes divisions, right? There are people that leave church. There are people that are frustrated with church. And the truth is, and we can talk about it another time, many times, the biggest divisions in church, they don't come from arguing over convictions. And they actually don't even come about arguing about persuasions. Most issues in the church, and most people in the church are frustrated by what? Opinions and simple preferences, whether it's music, the type of chairs, the way I dress, the way we're preaching, the style of whatever, it doesn't matter. They're just preference choices, not right, not wrong. So we have to be very careful that we dial in our opinions to make sure we're not stressing them more than we should. Listen, we all make mistakes. We all make mistakes. It's very, very easy to move things into the wrong bucket. And there's so much more we could say about that. So much more we could say about it. But the big question you have to start asking is, do I have everything in the correct bucket? It's a lot of work to figure that out. Do I have everything in the correct bucket? We have to evaluate and process how we think about the things we think about. How should we think about them? How should we think about the things that we think about? Here's what you should think. I need to think about the things I think about thoughtfully. I need to think about them purposefully. And I need to think about them humbly. If I can say one thing as we close, that's the idea. Wouldn't it be great if we as followers of Jesus were known to think that way? What do you think about your faith? How do you think about the things you believe and practice? I think about them thoughtfully, purposefully, and with humility. You see, the things that we believe, God cares about that a lot. And the things we do, God cares about that a lot. Those things matter a great deal to God. But we're always going to engage and we're always going to interact with people outside the church and inside the church who have different beliefs, different belief systems. And all of those connecting points, those differences don't have to lead to disagreement. And most importantly, all of those disagreements, they don't have to lead to division. We don't have to get spun up over all of it. Not if we apply God's truth, not if we're purposeful, intentional, and walk in humility. So I encourage you, start this week as you think about your beliefs. You can do it in your home, do it with friends, do it with family. We're going to put some questions up as we end today, some questions to get you started in this evaluation. Ultimately asking a question, are there any current beliefs, any current practices? Is there anything that you feel prompted to reassess in any area of your life, including your faith? Are there things you know you're holding too tightly, or are there things you actually need to hold more tightly? Start to do the work of walking through the process. Let's pray.